So what does it mean then to be a follower of Jesus? Peter was one of the core leaders in the Jesus movement. And yet here Peter apparently can't understand, appreciate, or believe what Jesus is saying about the call and the cost of discipleship. This exchange between Peter and Jesus in some ways is a perfect metaphor for the history of institutional Christianity that has followed. The call to discipleship and the forces that keep us from fulfilling that call. The both and. Or to use another metaphor, the DNA, I'm doing my hands like this, the DNA of the institutional church brings with it strands of blessing and beauty, ritual and resources, family and faith. And it also carries within it strands of barriers and burdens, rigidity and racism, dogma and discrimination, all those strands shaped by the people themselves and the contexts in which they lived. Part of our task in this process of honoring the sacred, storied soil in which we're rooted is to look at the DNA of the Lutheran church that gave birth to leaven, salt, and light. To tease apart those strands and their contexts and discern which strands to pull forward and nurture, which strands to leave behind, and which to transform for the sake of the leaven, salt, and light community that is still yet to be. So today, to look at some of those strands together, we have two very special guests. Pastor Terry Moe was pastor of Redeemer Lutheran from 1981 until 2013, when Leaven, Salt, and Light was given birth. And Cathy Miller, who was baptized at Redeemer as a young girl, who poured her life into the church as a young mother from the mid-70s to around 2000, and whose great-grandparents, Martha and G.R. Magadans, German immigrants, were core founders of the church. But before we jump into the conversation, let's put a few dates next to each other so we can get a sense of the context in which this congregation was founded. This explicitly English-speaking congregation started as a Sunday school in August of 1919 at Baker Hall on Alberta, near 18th on the south side of the street. And in February of 1920, just a few months later, G.R. Magadans, Cathy's great-grandpa, purchased the first building for Redeemer at 15th and Wygant for $2,800, about $40,000 today. By March, they were incorporated with the state. So this congregation was formed between August of 1919 and March of 1920. So what else was going on at that time? So as we heard last week in LaVeta's story, the indigenous people of the land had already, by that time, been killed or removed to reservations far from the Portland area. In 1912, white women were granted the right to vote in Oregon, 8 years before the 19th Amendment. But at the time of the church's founding, Oregon's constitution still banned Black people from coming to the state, residing in the state, or holding property in the state. Oregon chose not to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments of equal protection and giving Black people the right to vote until 1973 and 1959, respectively. In 1919, the year the congregation started, the Portland Board of Realty approved a code of ethics prohibiting realtors and bankers from selling property in white neighborhoods to people of color or providing mortgages for such purposes. So Cathy's great-grandpa could purchase the land, but a Black contemporary of his could not. In 1922, Oregon's governor, Walter Pierce, was overtly supported by the Klan and promoted their agenda. In 1920, there were as many as 20,000 Klan members in Oregon, compared to only 2,000 African Americans. In 1917, the Immigration Act essentially banned all immigrants from coming to the United States. And from 1919 to 1921, the same years of the church's founding, the Palmer Raids, which were a series of US justice and immigration roundups of suspected radical leftists, were happening in Portland. Many resident immigrants were deported because of their alleged radical political views. Is this deja vu all over again? Also, how could we forget that between 1918 and 1921, there were 48,000 cases of the Spanish flu in Oregon and almost 4,000 deaths. We're getting there in terms of deaths in Oregon in our pandemic. And if all that weren't enough, from April of 1917 to November 1919, the US was involved in World War I, a war Germany lost. So before that war was over, Cathy's German immigrant great-grandparents founded an English-speaking church. Redeemer Lutheran Church was founded by immigrants in the middle of a profoundly racist city and state, in the middle of a war, and in the middle of a pandemic. Dang. It opens up so many questions, right? Like, why? Why, within all that complex context, why did they found the church? Why did the church matter so much to them? How did they have the resources? What was the DNA of the church they founded? And what strands of that DNA have been carried forward over the years? What strands have been left behind? And what strands have been and can still be transformed? So of course, we can't answer all those questions, but we can start with some pictures and some stories and some reflections. So I'm going to take just a moment and share just a couple of pictures. Can you see a picture of the church building? So this was the church building that Cathy's grandpa purchased. And it was the home of Redeemer until 1952. But in 1943, the congregation purchased the land at 20th and Killingsworth for $1,000. Unbelievable, right? In February of 1952, they laid the cornerstone, and then the building was dedicated. And this was the floor plan of the original church. So you see where the nave was, that's the sunroom and the chapel. And the altar that is still in the chapel was the altar there, and then the sacristy, and then one Sunday school room there. And then I'm going to share one other picture. So that's what the building looks like today. And then I want to show this picture. And Cathy, I'm going to ask you to unmute and just tell us who a couple of these folks are, and then I'll take it off screen and you can start to share some of what you remember.
This is my great-grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary celebration that was held at Redeemer. And so that's Gus and Martha in the center. And I was reading a news article, and it was revealed to me I was their first great-grandchild. And I'm standing in front of my mother, Lorraine Burns, and she was pregnant with my sister, Karen, at the time. And my grandfather, Boppy, that I named him, Al up there, he drove me to Sunday school every Sunday to attend. He was a widower and a bachelor, and he was one of 5 kids. There's 4 boys and 1 girl. Marcel is the daughter, and her husband's behind him. They're standing behind my great-grandmother Martha. And anyway, Bill was also a physician at Emmanuel Hospital and on church council. And in fact, he invited me to be on Redeemer's church council. And anything else you think I could add?
No, that's great. I'll take it off share, but you'll notice that this is right in the chapel, which was the sanctuary. You can see that skinny stained glass window that's in the
Yep.
chapel.
And that was probably 1957. I think I was about 2.5 years old there.
Well, Cathy, let's start with you and tell us, what else you remember, again, using this kind of rough metaphor of the DNA, like what was the DNA of the church that, as you understood that your great-grandparents founded, and then what was it in your own experience?
It's really interesting. It was shocking to find out that he had donated that $2,800. It was right there in the 75th anniversary bulletin, totally overlooked. I was inspired to call some of my cousins, and it was never talked about. I think it was my Uncle Bill that guilted me into joining council, because my family, after all, was one of the founding fathers. It's like, okay. So anyway, my DNA was a gift from my grandfather, Boppy, picking me up and taking me to Sunday school. And that was the beginning of my spiritual foundation, and Redeemer was it. And I learned about the love and shared in learning the songs and the stories. And it was a very special time. I remember the other buildings around Redeemer, because it was growing so fast. The other homes were bought to accommodate the expanding Sunday school. It was an incredible time to grow up and be a part of that. I remember the addition. I remember the groundbreaking of that, and watching the building being established and the new Sunday school rooms. And I remember my baptism. I was probably 5 or so, and my 2 younger sisters and I on an Easter Sunday. And I remember going outside on the sidewalk, and there were daffodils and tulips blooming, and I joined my great uncles and my grandfather and tugged on their pant legs and said, "I'm a child of God now, I've arrived." Anyway, it was a time of celebration and good humor, and it was a fun memory there.
Yeah.
And it's still a mystery of how he could have afforded. I found out some additional information. He immigrated when he was about 6 months old. They came over. He was from Stettin, Germany is where he was born. And he arrived on a ship named the Nuremberg. It docked in Baltimore, of all places. He met my grandmother in Revilla, South Dakota, and I found out he got kicked out of Revilla, and that's how they somehow ended up in Portland. So I thought that was an interesting thing. I guess he ran a creamery in South Dakota, and it's possible that he was in partnership with a gas station in downtown Portland at the time. But that I could not coordinate. He also worked for Wonder Bakery, which is across from Benson High School. He also was a cable car conductor. What else did he do? Anyway, one cousin accused him of possibly getting the money from the black market. Anyway, I tried to corner that person, but anyway, I just had to throw that out there for entertainment's sake. Anyway,
that's for real.
yeah,
He got kicked out of a town.
Yeah. Part of my DNA structure that I also have on there for my own is part of the burdens and the abuses and the grace that goes along with that strand. Anyway, so yeah. Anyway, and to put it in perspective, he was 37 years old to be able to make that kind of donation, and I guess he had a lot of energy, and thought that was really something. The other piece of so that's the finances part. I'm trying to use some of my old organizing lessons that I learned. Hi, Dick Harmon. Anyway, is follow the money. And so I tried to do that, but also the land. My family, Redeemer was like a magnet. And then the properties, the Magadanzas were over on 24th. My other great grandparents, they were on 14th. And my grandmother, Bobby's wife, her family was there. Then after that, my grandmother, my father's mother, she lived also on 14th. And it was because of that my dad joined Redeemer's Luther League and the baseball team. And that's where my parents met. Anyway, so all the properties around there and the friends and the activities and almost all of the cousins and what have you all lived in Northeast Portland, from Union or Martin Luther King out to, I would say, 102nd to 90th off of Killingsworth, up through Prescott. That was, yeah. So I think it's really interesting how Redeemer was that magnet for them.
Yeah. Well, Terry, why don't you jump in? We can weave the stories together as we go.
Okay, thank you. Good to be with you all, and very nice to see you again, Cathy, and make reacquaintance as we did last week after a long hiatus, too long of a hiatus. So I just wanted to share that I also grew up in the first English-speaking Lutheran church in Eugene, which has exactly the same floor plan as Redeemer. So the congregation chose to keep the old sanctuary, and so they still worship in that space. It's pretty small, but they chose to build a social hall and Sunday school rooms instead of a new sanctuary when they rebuilt. So it's still dear to my heart because I went to Sunday school there, was baptized there, married there, ordained there. My parents were both buried from there. So the congregation has meant really a lot to me. United Lutheran in Eugene, formed in 1925. So about the same era. I didn't know that my legacy with the Lutheran Church went further than my affiliation with United until I was about 50 years old. And we were in Minnesota visiting our relatives, and my dad asked if I wanted to go to church in the morning to kind of get away from my mom's side of the family. So we went out into the middle of this cornfield in Bemidji, Minnesota, to Ardall Lutheran Church. And as we're going in, he nonchalantly announces, "This was your great-grandfather's church." So I didn't know that my family had this legacy, because my parents, when they came west in 1948, kind of left the old country and the church behind until they reestablished in 1961. So there was this hiatus, and I'm kind of glad to be reconnected with that, though, because I was kind of envious of all these people who sort of had a strong lineage, like you, Cathy, generations back. So just reflecting on your story, and I would have to agree with the DNA of kind of family, Sunday school, emphasis on children. So I just really felt welcomed and part of the congregation. The shadow side of that is, can I get into that a little bit? So kind of.
Go.
Okay. I mean, it was a pretty male. Well, it was a male-dominated church. And even when I came to Redeemer in 1981, it was still just breaking up of not only clergy-wise, because women were not ordained in our denomination until 1970. So even though, I mean, that's 50 years ago, but that's late. And then the first woman council president at Redeemer wasn't until 1983. So there were council women participating when I was there, but they were kind of unused to it. They hadn't really been tutored in that kind of public life. And so I think it was difficult for women to participate, especially the older women. I'm not talking about your generation, Cathy, but I think the older women, Margaret Finseth and Agnes Christensen and others, Carolyn Tom, who were part of the council, it was just difficult to kind of get into that male-dominated society aspect. So that's one piece. I think the other piece is, while the congregational life and the family life go together, there's also an inherent exclusivity to that, as like whose family, and then whose congregation. And if they don't look like me, act like me, believe like me, it's difficult to have a more inclusive coherence or community. So I think, my time at Redeemer was, recognizing a congregation that was struggling, and at that time really starting to decline, or in fact had declined from, 263 members in 263 members in worship on an average Sunday in 1963 to about 100. So less than half. And continued to decline, over my time. I don't take responsibility for the decline. I'm going to shift that to the interns, because I noticed that the real decline started to happen in 1990 when we got interns. We kind of maintained ourselves, and then after that, it was downhill after that. Right,
Nice.
Solveig? Yeah.
Nice.
So
Nice, Terry.
that was very nice. Yeah. So on the other hand, it was interns who I think turned the culture from a male-dominated organization to a more inclusive. So of the 18 interns we had, 14 were women, and the congregation got used to women standing at the altar, preaching, being at the council meetings, having the role of a pastor, even though they were intern students. They got used to it, and not just one, but 14. So they got to see a variety of women in leadership roles. And I think that was really a key to kind of opening up Redeemer to that side of the community. Racially, the congregation was already somewhat mixed when I came. So there were members from a previous all Black Lutheran church that I just learned about in the last couple of years, Bethesda Lutheran. Vivian Richardson came from that community. Laura Barber and her family, her large extended family, Elnora Williams, came primarily, as she told the story, because they wanted better education for their children, and they enrolled them at Trinity Lutheran School, but Redeemer was closer to where they lived, so they joined the congregation. And they were both matriarchs in the congregation when I arrived in 1981, as well as Ben Webb, married to Vi Webb, black and white, very dark African looking man, and Vi Webb, very tall Finnish white person. Oh, there's Bethesda. So Vivian Richardson is kind of at the very back and tall. I don't know if you have a pointer. So yeah, that's her right there. That's Vivian Richardson. I don't know any of the other people. I think the congregation only lasted 10 years or so before it folded, but that's Vivian Richardson. So I was grateful for that foundation with a few Black leaders in the congregation. And through the years, we gained some and we lost some. So especially in the, the early years, we gained members from the Black community through baptism. And, Darrell King was a great witness and apostle in the neighborhood where he lived, and other people, our vacation church school, Cathy and Nancy and others organized. I think we got a number of people engaged and involved. When the community, and you talked about sort of the outside forces, when the community started to shift, and there were a number of forces, Solveig, you'll be aware of this, and I think other people. So the war on drugs and the imprisonment of a lot of Black young people affected a lot of the people in our congregation. And some of the young people that we baptized in 1988 ended up being incarcerated. Many of them ended up with addiction issues. And it was sort of like Ron Herndon said, this isn't the war on drugs, this is the war on Blacks. And it really was, but I didn't realize that. I mean, it was too much information too fast. So that was one factor. And then the people call it gentrification, but started in the mid 90s, and I think it continues now with the high price of housing and the moving in of white people that don't have as much experience in a mixed race community. Cathy, you said, you wanted to go to a church that was mixed race for the sake of your children. And that was true for me too, and for others, but I'm not sure that's a big value right now. And, frankly, the immediate neighborhood around the church now is not as mixed as it used to be. In fact, the neighborhood where you grew up, Park Rose, and where I now live, is much more mixed, which is interesting. So I could say more, but maybe that's enough for now.
Oh, I want this conversation to continue. I guess I'll just add my piece, because I was an intern in 94, 95. And in terms of the DNA strands, and there's an institutional piece. Institutions are organized people and organized money. And I was so grateful. And I would never have been able to come out here and have this experience were it not for what was called the Horizon program at that point. So that was the ELCA, the institutional church, putting money so that future pastors could serve internships in either urban or rural congregations. And it was because of that program that I ended up coming out and being able to be an intern in the community. So there's there's so many, and it was the interracial nature of the community was one of the big draws for me, because that wasn't in my experience growing up, and I needed that that immersion in that way. And Cathy, I think you were on my intern committee, so I'm so grateful for that. So the many threads getting pulled together